welcome to the channel. I'm Rob, and today we're going to be painting a heavily weathered Death Guard tank. So we have this tank on the table today. We're going to be focusing a lot on weathering, obviously. It's the Death Guard. We're going to be focusing a lot on hairspray chipping. So if you haven't seen this method done before, this is going to be a great video for you guys. But we're also going to be focused on how to do the different layers of weathering and making them look correct. So we get a tank that ends up looking like this. Prime your tank black. And then I've given this a mix of oak brown and black as a primer. Now I'm working in lots of sub-assemblies today. And the reason for that is so I can get into all those nooks and crannies with our hairspray chipping. With our brown tank, what we're going to do, we're just going to use dabs of orange from Archangel Red. It says Archangel Red, but it's more an orange. And what we're going to do, we're just going to lay this over our brown base coat. Now, this will is a great way to kind of illustrate rust underneath a tank. In reality, though, I think that because of the size of the scratches that I did on the tank, if you missed out this process, you wouldn't be missing a lot. But certainly on bigger tanks, and if we've got more scratching, I think that this is definitely worthwhile. We're going to use some hairspray. I think it's called Silver Crin. And then we're just going to lay this all over the tank. Now, I gave the tank a gloss varnish before laying this down. I let the gloss varnish cure for a bit and then applied the hairspray all over it. I'll talk about the hairspray in a moment and why we use it. And then I'm going to lay down my base coat. Now, I've used skeleton bone, which is one of the mid colours. I didn't want a lot of contrast within this particular tank, just because I wanted to match the rest of my army. One thing I would say though, you've used hairspray on this and a gloss varnish as well. So you know, the tendency for the paint, if you put it on too thick here, it will not grip to the tank. So one of the things I would really recommend is build it up in really thin layers. And this will just help you get a decent coat over the tank. And you know, once you put a layer down, use a hairdryer, and then do another layer, etc., etc. Okay. Make sure you get the entire tank. Make sure you get all the nooks and crannies as well. And you can see this is what the colour looks like once it's been given 2 or 3 thin coats. So it's a really nice kind of bone colour. But we will further highlight that colour with bleach bone. My own Death Guard are actually really super pale, so it's an off-white essentially. Now I've added a little bit of contrast in, but not a whole lot. You know, most of the tank is actually this bleach bone colour, but it's up to you whether you want to put loads of contrast in. You know, we've talked about colour modulation in different videos before, and the one thing I would say though is that the lightness is that it will be lost any contrast that you use because of how much we're going to weather it. But I would go lighter, almost this very off-white colour than you might want your Death Guard to be, because we're just going to knock it back so far. It's not going to end up looking like this colour in any way, shape or form at the end. So go much brighter than you think you need to go. And if you want it brighter than the end result that we've got, then you could always go to pure white as well and airbrush it with pure white. Make sure you do all of the other elements as well of the tank. So you saw that I had the exhausts off there. The doors are off as well, and then the hatches are off as well. As I say, we do that so when we do the battle damage in a moment, we can it's just easier to get to those places. Now I've got a makeup sponge here, and I've cut off most of the makeup sponge, so it's quite a rough and hard sponge. And what I've done to reactivate the hairspray underneath is that I've just soaked the tank in water. Now I would recommend that you do a panel at a time or a couple of panels at a time, rather than doing the whole tank in one go, because by the time you get to the back of the tank and you've done all this process to the back, the water will have dried. So so working panels is my best advice. So what happens is that the water reactivates the hairspray underneath, which means that you can pull away the paint relatively easily. Now, some product, the amount of hairspray that we use, the amount of water that we use, and the tool that we use will dictate how readily the paint comes off. You could see how much hairspray I used. Like I just gave it a toot all over the tank, so I wasn't too heavy with it. And you can see kind of the brush strokes I'm using. I'm really focusing on the edges here more than any other part. I think that this process is absolutely brilliant, but I think that, like with all battle damage, I'm talking about that with a heavily weathered Death Guard tank, but sometimes less is more, and you've got to think about where the weathering and battle damage will happen, which will be all the corners of the tank, certainly the bottom of the tank. Now, the problem with chipping a tank in this way and doing battle damage like this is that you have less control than, say, with a sponge or with a brush. Basically, sometimes you pull away paint that you're not intending to pull away, and that's one of the issues around this. So it will take a bit of practice, and I won't lie, like this was it's been a long time since I've done a whole tank in this method, and I found that I was taking off bits of paint that I didn't want to take off. But it was a great learning experience, but just be careful when approaching this process, I think. But we're starting to get little by little that brown coming through. Now you can see here that actually it's hard to distinguish between the browns and the oranges that I laid down initially. So there are patches where you can see the orange, and those will be a little bit, you'll be able to see those a little bit later. But it's not a necessary step, just a step that I want to show you that you could potentially do. Now you can see here that I'm further enhancing the hairspray kind of chipping, or the chipping that we're creating, by using a very sharp hobby knife. Now I can confidently do this because I know that the gloss varnish that we've used underneath is protecting the brown underneath, so I'm not pulling away any paint, and I'm just very gently doing this, catching up all of the edges. This helps to render the tank, catching all those edges. It almost edge highlights it in a negative way. But what you didn't see me do here was actually, again, hit the tank with that blast of water from the airbrush. So I'm just using clean water from the airbrush, just normal tap water, through the airbrush, just to reactivate that chipping. And when I feel that it's getting harder and harder to pull off paint, that's again when I will reactivate the hairspray in order to let the paint kind of fleck away. But the scalpel or a hobby knife is a great tool to pick out all the edges and create lots of different scratches. And you can see here, I've slowed it down for you, but you can see kind of what the tank looks like in the end once you've gone through this process. Yeah, it's going to be quicker if you do it with a sponge. I get that, right? And if you're working on a project at speed, then do it with a sponge. But it creates a certain kind of effect, the hairspray chipping method, that a sponge simply cannot create. And in some ways, this is probably more realistic and looks more realistic than doing it with a sponge. Although a sponge is a fantastic tool, and you've seen me use it all the time in videos. But this is what it looks like. The top hatch, it all went disastrously wrong on the top hatch. So basically later on, you'll see that I decide to cover it with a transfer. I weathered it way too heavily. I was pulling away way too much paint. And I was just like, oh, this is. I intended it just to be a blank panel, but actually, I pulled up way too much away. So I will cover that with a transfer a little bit later. So there's nothing that can't be corrected, especially on larger flat panels that a transfer can't fix. Okay, so give the whole of the tank another gloss varnish. We have to, within this process, do quite a lot of gloss varnishing to protect every stage of the painting process. But also don't forget, when we start applying water and things like that, we don't want to reactivate the hairspray again and start pulling things away. So now it's protected. I'm confident that I can do masking, I can apply more water, and it's not going to pick away the bone color that we've done already. I'm not going to lie, this was a total nightmare to mask because we have all those lumps and bumps. But after I've glossed it, I've then hit it with some more hairspray. So we're going to go through exactly the same process as we did with our white, now with our green, because every layer has to be weathered in a similar way. And that's really important. Everything that we do has to be consistent with this paint job to be able to make it look realistic. And the transfers are the bit that I think, when I see people do this kind of method, it's the transfers that I think that people get wrong most of the time. So I'll talk you through exactly how to weather those transfers accurately to make it look in keeping with the rest of the tank. But as I say, I put hairspray down before applying this green. And this green is Army Green, fantastic colour for the Death Guard. And also, don't forget, you want colours that will match with the transfers that we're going to use as well. So, when you're choosing colours, don't just think, oh, okay, this green looks good. Think, okay, what's going to match with the transfers that I'm using? Because you want it to be harmonious with the entirety of the paint job. It would look weird if we have a different green to the one that we're laying down, right? So just something to consider. And I think that with these two colours, so I used Army Green as the base and then Drab Green as the highlight, they match perfectly with the transfers, and you'll see that a little bit later. There is inevitably going to be some overspray because you can see here that the masking tape isn't quite flat against the rhino, and I felt confident going in that was okay. You can see a little bit of overspray just on the side of the tank because there's hairspray down. Before I apply this green, I know that I can pull any overspray away with this hobby knife or with a cotton wool bud to straighten up that line. So that's just a neat little trick. If you can't get the masking tape perfect when doing this method, it's okay. The hairspray will allow us to pull away any overspray that we've done. Okay, so you can see here exactly the same process. What I'm doing is I'm just making everything all in keeping. So this green stripe has been painted over the top of the bone color. That's how some tech adept will have done it, or some servitor will have done it. So we've got to go through exactly that process, but so we need to make it look in keeping, and we're going to wear this away. And any overspray as well can be taken away just by creating some scratches, and any parts that aren't straight can be used to create scratches as well. You can see I'm really focusing heavily on places where there'll be lots of wear and tear. So I can really imagine Space Marines as they get out the tank holding the edges of the tank, for example, and then the paint just being worn away over campaigns and worn away over time. The Death Guard are quite famous for not necessarily kind of like repainting their armor all the time. I guess they're showing their wounds and the damage from previous campaigns, and they kind of want to show that through their armor. So, and a rhino is one of those things that's going to be beaten up most of all. There's a lot of the heavy lifting for the Legion, so we really want it to be absolutely battered. So you can see here, though, I'm going through doing weathering, and what this has the benefit of as well. So not only are we picking out the bone color, but also it's revealing some of the brown elements as well. That kind of very first layer of paint. I guess I would describe that brown element as kind of like the ceramite, right? Very rare are the times where I would use pure silver, or I would sponge on pure silver. I think in my head I've got ceramite being kind of like a dull, quite a dull color, be it grey or brown or whatever. But there's just something so nice about the brown against that about that pale bone color. It just contrasts so nicely on the tank. It works really well, and it's the reason why Imperial Fists work well. When you chip it with brown, it just contrasts really, really nicely with the entirety of the tank. So you can see here, this is our tank so far, and then we need to give it another gloss varnish. So we're actually going to use 4 layers in total of gloss varnish here. And we're using gloss varnish ready for the transfers. Now, I wanted to show you quite a lot of this process because, you know, it's one of those things where we've got loads of paint has flecked away and shown the ceramite underneath. Let's just call it ceramite for argument's sake at the moment. I know some people, that will drive people mad because people will be like, oh, ceramite's not brown. But we're just going to say it's ceramite. The issue that we've got is that we've got this absolutely ruined and battered paint job, and now we're painting over the top of that really pristine decals and transfers, and it just isn't, it doesn't look, although the transfers look good, right, it just doesn't make sense in the context of how kind of damaged our tank is. So we need to sort that, and this process, I'm going to show you how you can do that with a number of different ways, but just to make it in keeping. I put down this transfer here, which is one of the great banner transfers from the Death Guard decal sheet, and then I was like, oh, actually it's not long enough for a rhino door, which is pretty unusual. The other one actually is long enough for a rhino door, whereas this one isn't, so pretty strange. Anyway, so we gloss varnish the tank. This basically allows our transfers to sit nice and smoothly, especially considering that we've pulled away chunks of paint. So this is not a smooth surface before this gloss varnish is down. So we make it smooth so our transfers can adhere really nicely to our tank. And then we use micro set, and then we lay down the transfer over the top of that micro set. Now what you can see me doing here is I've taken the bottom of the because I really liked this transfer, and I preferred it over the other one. So what I did was chopped off the bottom of the transfer that did fit to just extend it slightly, and you can see a line between the two where it's overlapped. But basically, by the time we're finished, I'll kind of show you how to weather it that you won't notice the line at all between the two. Loads of people ask me about these flat transfers and how we get them over rhino doors. So this is it basically. So what you can see me doing here is I've left it for probably about 5 minutes, this transfer. So I applied the micro set and then put the transfer down, and then what you can see me doing on all the rivets is just getting all the places where the transfer, you can see the air bubbles in fact over the rivets where it's caught the air, and you just need to pop those air bubbles in order to let the air out. But I've also, what I've done here as well is gone over the door, and then just with a very, in fact I use a surgical scalpel, I don't use a hobby knife, so it's super sharp, you know, it just cuts through the transfer really easily. So, and what we do is just we trace that line of the rhino door just to cut it in two, so it's not so there's a clear and visible line you know, where the door would open. This is a great example, this side door here, of where you can see that the transfer should be over the green, but actually it's over it's over the pale bone colour. So what we need to do is basically anywhere where a transfer shouldn't be showing, we need to go in with our brush and go in with the original colours that we used, and we just need to paint over those colours as if the transfer's just on the green and not showing through on that bone colour. And this is what makes it look realistic, and this is the kind of attention to detail that you need to put in when using when doing sponge chipping. Okay, so really important. And what we can also do is use a little, sorry, I said sponge chipping there because I saw the sponge. What I meant is hairspray chipping. This is the attention to detail that you need to use when using hairspray chipping. Really important. But what we can also do is just slightly weather these transfers, just showing that actually the paint that's being used to put them on is starting to fleck away and the green is starting to show through. So we've got multiple layers of weathering just on one transfer. And that's the kind of attention to detail that you will need to use, especially with things like Death Guard, right? You can see me just adding in where the transfer is over the brown elements there of the ceramite. You can see me just painting a mix of oak brown and black over the top of it as well. And you see me just trying to wipe away some of the green and then me realizing, oh, I've gloss varnished that, so that's not gonna happen. Right, so how do we weather a transfer? This is how. So we can either paint over the top of it, we can sponge over the top of it, but with something this large, and to make it look realistic, we're going to go to our hobby knife. I've left this to dry. I've dried it with a hairdryer on a cool setting, so it's nice and flat. So I'm not peeling away the entire transfer. But the issue that you've got is I could use a sponge here, but it wouldn't be in keeping with the rest of the battle damage on the tank. That's, I think, one of the main issues. So it's better to use a sharp scalpel and to start chipping away at this transfer. One of the things I would say is that as you chip away, you might notice that there's kind of like a white line around the chipping. That's just from, you know, the white backing on the transfer. We'll get rid of that a little bit later. Don't worry too much about that. But as you can see, I'm just going in randomly, you know, catching all the edges, thinking about where the paintwork might be damaged. You know, certainly on the edges of the doors, that's where it's going to really there's going to be a lot of damage. It always looks really nice when taking away paint or, you know, transfers from the edges of the actual transfer itself, you know, not necessarily the edges of the doors, but the edges of the transfers. That straight line that's just been broken up with a few scratches. It's up to you how much you weather it. You need to. It still needs to read as a transfer. So, you know, don't do a whole lot, particularly on the skull, because you want to make sure it reads as a skull. But we'll fade this in a little bit with some oils, just to make it kind of make more sense. And what you can see me doing is just exactly that. So with some oils, this is a mix of 1 part Payne's Grey and 3 parts burnt umber. So a little bit darker than just usual burnt umber. I'm doing an oil pin wash here. You've seen me do this loads in videos before, so I didn't want to talk too much about it. But I did cover the entire transfer in this oils, because I was concerned that some of the whites on the edges that I'd picked away at would just be a little bit unsightly. So this is just a great way to be able to kind of get rid of them. So you can see here, this is all cleaned up with the cotton wool bud in white spirit. I've done loads of videos about oils before, so check out some of my previous videos about using oils. But essentially, we gave it an oil pin wash. I've then cleaned it up with a cotton wool bud, and this is what it looks like. Now it's time for the real fun. So this is a mixture of burnt sienna, which is basically a rust colour, and burnt umber, and I've mixed them together. I really, really don't like burnt sienna as a colour. I think it's just way too bright on its own. Really don't like it, but I do like the combination of burnt sienna and burnt umber. Probably just favouring slightly the burnt umber, and this makes a gorgeous rust streaking colour. And you can see the mix of the two here. I've mixed them together, they're neat. I put them at the top of any areas where I want this to be streaking, any battle damage, and you'll see here, not just at the top of panels, although it always looks great when you put it at the top of panels, but also on any of the smaller scratches as well, where I want some streaking to be. You know, underneath those the rims of the windows as well. And then I take a flat brush, a fan brush in this case, dip it in some clean white spirit, and then take most of that white spirit off, and then drag it down. And then it creates this amazing streaking effect with not that much work, with the randomness of the streaking, the randomness of the fan brush, and then we've got a tank that looks like this. This is what our tank looks like so far. This has been given a matte varnish, Army Painter's matte varnish. Once all that streaking's been done, and once the oils have dried, I gave maybe an hour to dry, hit it with a hairdryer just to speed it up a little bit. And then onto the metallics. So I'm doing the metallics now, but you'll see in a bit how we're going to weather them. So basically, I gave them a coat of night scales, then I dry brushed with shining silver. Just a light dry brush. I really didn't want them to be super bright, but these are the rust effects that I really want to kind of show you guys. So we need to make the metals in keeping with the entire rest of the tank. It's not a good look if we have really bright shiny metals. and we have a really dirty tank. So what I've done here, I've taken molten, I think that was molten orange, I think. Let's have a look. Molten orange, yeah. And I've thinned this with some airbrush thinner. I like to thin these kinds of things with airbrush thinners because I find that using airbrush thinner, you avoid that coffee staining that sometimes can happen when you mix things with water. I just find that airbrush thinner just flows a little bit more nicely for these kinds of effects. So that was molten orange mixed with oak brown, and that was our initial kind of like base layer. Then I'm going to go in with just molten orange. So I'm going to build up those rust effects bit by bit, I think is the integral bit here. I'm not just going in with our brightest rust effect. I'm going in with the dark rust effect. Then I'm going to go in with the molten orange. Then I'm going to go in with an even brighter one. And you can build it up, build it up. Now it looks quite powerful at this moment in time, but it does dry and get knocked back. So don't worry at the moment what it kind of looks like. In terms of the headlights, I just always paint them silver. I think it looks always a little bit weird where you've got like a bright yellow, a beautiful kind of grim, dark, grimy paint job, and then bright yellow headlights. I think so just paint them silver, or don't put them on. You know, either one of those. And we're just washing this over the entirety of those metallic areas, and then we're going to use incursion orange, which is like the most vibrant orange imaginable, and you can just see it's kind of mixed slightly with the molten orange just to knock it back. But this is super bright, but gives a really great effect in terms of our rust. With rust effects, if you're using paints, I'd really recommend in building it up in this way rather than just going for the straight color. I think it looks more realistic. We have different tones of rust just because of the nature of weathering, and this whole video has been about creating realistic weathering, right? So let's put this, the metals take a small bit of effort to do, so let's make them look right. And you can see here, this is our finished tank. So it's a little bit more effort than using a sponge, using hairspray chipping. It's fun, is something that I would say. It's great fun to do, particularly on tanks. Sakaran in this scheme, a Kratos in this scheme would look really cool. A bit harder with infantry. There I might kind of go, you know what, I'm just going to use a sponge instead of using hairspray chipping because of just the size of it, right? But ultimately, it's up to you. I think that hairspray chipping 10 guys in a squad might be a bit of a chore. It's a bit more fun when when doing it on tanks. But hopefully, you guys can use this video, walk away from it having learned something new, maybe something you've never considered before, and create an excellent battered looking weather tank. As I always say, if you enjoyed the video, give me a comment. If you enjoyed the video and it's the first time watching, don't forget to subscribe as well. Really appreciate it. And if you like the video, don't forget to share it far and wide so others can see it as well.